October 1994. A loading bay behind a regional grocery distribution center on the eastern edge of Knoxville, Tennessee. A 1988 Ford F-250 flatbed has backed into the receiving dock just before 7 in the morning. The woman climbing down from the cab is 44 years old. Her name is Lottie Fenn. She is wearing canvas work gloves, a flannel shirt, the color of creek mud, and a pair of rubber-soled boots she has owned since 1987. The flatbed behind her holds 47 wooden crates of dried culinary lavender oil in 4-ounce amber bottles, and bundled stems of fresh-cut English lavender wrapped in craft paper and packed in ice. She grew everything on the truck herself on 11 acres of eastern Tennessee ridgeland that 8 years earlier, every man who had ever farmed that county had told her was too thin, too rocky, and too exposed to grow anything worth selling. The receiving manager of the distribution center walks out to meet her. His name is Phil Garner. He has been sourcing specialty herbs and florals for the regional chain for 6 years. He has never had a supplier show up at his dock with product this consistent. The check he hands her at the end of the unloading is for $11,400. It is the largest single payment Lottie Fenn has received in her life. But this story does not begin in Knoxville. This story begins 7 years earlier, on a Wednesday afternoon in March of 1987, at a hardware store on the main square of Granger County, Tennessee, when Lottie Fenn walked in and asked the owner where she could find lavender seed stock, and the owner looked at her the way men in hardware stores look at women who have just asked a question that does not belong in a hardware store. Lottie was 37 years old. She had been widowed 14 months earlier when her husband, Ray Fenn, died of a heart attack at 52 while driving a tractor on the east field of their 90-acre farm outside Bean Station. Ray had farmed that ground in tobacco and corn for 19 years. The tobacco allotment had been shrinking since 1984. The corn prices had dropped below break even in 1985 and had not recovered. Ray had known the operation was in trouble and had not said so, the way men of his generation did not say so, and Lottie had known it too, and had not pressed him on it, the way she had learned not to press. When Ray died, Lottie inherited the farm, a $31,000 equipment loan at the First National Bank of Rogersville, and 11 acres of ridgeland on the western edge of the property that Ray had been planning to let go back to cedar because nothing they had planted on it in 19 years had produced at a rate that justified the work. The 11 acres sloped south and west at an angle of roughly 15 degrees. The soil on the ridge was thin, rocky, and alkaline, with a pH that consistently ran between 6.8 and 7.4 when Lottie tested it in the winter of 1987. Ray had considered it a liability. Lottie looked at the slope and the drainage and the southern exposure, and she thought something different. She did not say what she thought to anyone. She drove to the library in Bean Station and checked out every book they had on specialty herb farming. The library had 2. She drove to the University of Tennessee Agricultural Extension Office in Rutledge and asked for publications on alternative crops for thin alkaline ridge soil in East Tennessee. The agent who helped her was a young man named Terry Albright, who had graduated from UT Knoxville the previous spring and who had never, in his 4 months on the job, been asked about lavender cultivation in Granger County. He found her one relevant publication and told her he would look for more. She thanked him and drove home. She read everything that night at the kitchen table. She made notes in the margins. She did the math on the 11 acres and the potential yield per square foot and the wholesale price of dried lavender per pound, which in 1987 was running between $12 and $18, depending on quality and buyer. She did the math again. She went to bed at midnight and lay awake for 2 hours, running the numbers differently and getting the same answer. She got up at 2 in the morning and made a cup of coffee and sat at the table again and looked at the numbers for another hour. Then she went to bed. She slept 4 hours. She got up at 6, fed the 2 remaining beef cows she had kept after Ray's death, and drove to the hardware store in Granger County to ask about lavender seed stock. The hardware store was owned by a 64-year-old man named Del Phipps, who had run it for 31 years and who considered himself knowledgeable about every agricultural practice in the county. Del did not know where to find lavender seed stock. Del did not know anyone who had grown lavender commercially in Granger County. Del looked at Lottie Fenn, standing across the counter from him, and he said, "Lottie, what in the world would you be wanting lavender seed for?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That ridge on the Fenn place?" She said yes. He said, "Ray always said that ridge wasn't good for much." She said she knew what Ray had said. Del looked at the counter for a moment, and then he said, carefully, "Lavender is a French thing, Lottie. This is Granger County." He said it the way a reasonable man says a reasonable thing. Lottie thanked him and drove home. She found the seed stock herself through a mail-order nursery in Oregon that specialized in commercial lavender varieties. She ordered Hidcote and Vera, both English varieties bred for high oil content and strong stem. She ordered enough to plant approximately half an acre as a trial. She paid $214 from a savings account that held $4,800. She had no other capital. She had the equipment loan and a property tax bill due in October, and a daughter named May, who was 16 and who had been quiet since Ray died in a way that Lottie recognized as grief folded under responsibility. May did not ask her mother what she was doing. May watched her the way teenagers watch their parents when something important is happening that the teenager understands is important without being told. The seed stock arrived on a Thursday in April. Lottie had spent the previous 3 weekends amending the trial half-acre with agricultural lime and coarse gravel raked 6 inches down into the ridge soil to improve drainage. She had borrowed a rototiller from her neighbor, a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher named Herschel Webb, who farmed 20 acres of hay on the property adjoining hers to the east. Herschel had lent her the tiller without asking why she needed it. He was the only person in the county, at that point, who had not asked why. The trial planting went in on a Saturday in late April, with May helping set plugs, while Lottie worked the row spacing. They planted 840 plugs across the half-acre at 18-inch intervals in rows spaced 30 inches apart. By the end of the day, May's knees were muddy and her back hurt, and she had not complained once. Lottie noticed. She did not say anything about it. She got in the truck and drove them home, and made dinner, and they ate without talking much, the way 2 people eat when they are tired, in a way that feels like something accomplished. The news of what Lottie Fenn had planted on the ridge traveled through Granger County the way news travels in small counties, which is through feed stores and church parking lots, and the counter at the diner on the main square. The tone it took on was not cruel. It was the tone that rural communities reserve for widows, who do things the community does not have a category for. She was managing all right for a woman alone. She had kept the farm from going to the bank. But lavender on that ridge, bless her heart, the ridge is worthless. She is going to lose every dollar she put in by August. Del Phipps told the story at his Ruritan Club meeting in May, with the particular gentleness of a man who believes he is protecting someone's dignity by keeping expectations low. There was a retired farmer at that meeting named Hugh Casper, who had farmed bottomland corn in the county for 40 years, and who said, after hearing Dell's account, "The pH on that ridge is all wrong for lavender." Hugh had never grown lavender. He said it with the confidence of a man who has spent 40 years being right about corn. He was at this moment wrong about lavender. The alkaline pH of the ridge was not a liability. It was exactly what English lavender required. Lottie had known this from the first library book. She had confirmed it in the extension publication. She had tested it herself with a soil kit she ordered from a garden supply catalog for $18. She had been certain about the pH before she ordered the seed. The community was not paying attention to any of that. The community was paying attention to the tobacco situation, which was worsening through 1987 as federal allotments continued to shrink, and to the cattle prices, which had recovered slightly from their 1985 lows, but were still not good. But it was dry June and a foreclosure on the Alderman farm on the north side of the county that had shaken people because the Aldermans had farmed that ground since 1941. The community was not paying attention to a half-acre of lavender plugs on a rocky ridge on the west side of the Fenn property, planted by a widow who had gotten the idea from a library book. The trial planting survived the first summer. Lottie lost approximately 18% of the plugs in the first 60 days, mostly on the upper quarter of the ridge, where drainage was fastest and the soil was thinnest. She replanted the failed spots in July with the remaining plugs she had kept in containers as backup. By September, the surviving plants were 8 to 10 inches tall, with healthy gray-green foliage. They had not yet bloomed. First-year lavender rarely does. The roots were establishing. That was the year's work, and Lottie understood it as such. She kept a notebook. She had started the notebook in April when the seed stock arrived, recording planting dates, row numbers, soil amendments by section, rainfall, and the condition of the plants every Saturday morning when she walked the rows. The notebook was a spiral-bound composition book, the kind that cost 49 cents at the drugstore. By October of 1987, she had filled 73 pages. In November, she started a second notebook. The second summer was different. The surviving plants, now in their second year, put up bloom spikes in late June. The bloom was not what a full, mature planting produces. It was partial, uneven, scattered across the ridge in the irregular pattern of survivors. But the fragrance when Lottie walked the rows in the early morning was something she had not been prepared for. She wrote in the notebook on June 28, 1988, "Full bloom on rows 4 through 9. Rows 1 to 3 still sparse. Fragrance in the morning before 8 a.m. is stronger than anything I have read about. Need to understand why morning. Possibly dew volatilizing the oil." She looked it up. She was right. The essential oil concentration in lavender blooms peaks in the early morning when overnight dew volatilizes on the surface of the flower. She had not been told this. She had figured it out from the smell of the ridge at 7 in the morning, confirmed it with a book, and written it in the notebook. She ordered a small copper still from a botanical supplier in Vermont the following spring. The still cost $340. She used it for the first time in the summer of 1989 on the first full harvest of the original half-acre. By the spring of 1988, Lottie had expanded the planting to cover 3 full acres of the ridge, but it was a dry, hot. She had done this by propagating new plants from heel cuttings taken from the second-year survivors, a technique she had read about in a British gardening journal she borrowed through interlibrary loan from the University of Tennessee library system. The propagation had taken most of the winter of 1987 to 88. She had kept the cuttings in a cold frame she McCunks. She built from salvaged lumber and old storm windows behind the equipment shed. May, who was 17 by then, had helped build the cold frame over a single weekend in November. May had figured out the corner joints herself, without being asked. Lottie had watched her work it out and had not interrupted. By spring, they had approximately 1,400 rooted cuttings ready to transplant. They planted them over 4 weekends in March and April of 1988. They did it without hired help. By the autumn of 1989, the planting covered 4.5 acres. Lottie did the first meaningful commercial harvest that summer, approximately 280 pounds of dried lavender from the original half-acre and the expanded second planting. She sold it to a craft supply wholesaler in Asheville, North Carolina, at $11 per pound for a total of $3,080. It covered the property tax bill, but it was a dry July. It covered 2 months of payments on the equipment loan. It was not profit. It was the beginning of something that could become profit in another year if the ridge performed, as she was now confident it would perform. She did not tell anyone in Granger County what the Asheville check was for. She deposited it at the First National Bank in Rogersville without comment. The loan officer who processed her payment, a man named Don Sykes, who had known Ray Fenn for 20 years, looked at the deposit amount and then looked at Lottie and said, "Things going okay out there, Lottie?" She said things were going fine. He nodded. He did not ask what was growing on the ridge. He had not been paying attention. May left for the University of Tennessee in Knoxville in September of 1989. She was studying agricultural science. She had decided this in the spring of her senior year without telling Lottie until she had already been accepted. She told Lottie at the kitchen table on an evening in April. Lottie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You didn't tell me you were applying." May said, "I didn't want you to say we couldn't afford it." Lottie was quiet again. She looked at her daughter. She thought about the cold frame they had built together in November. She thought about May figuring out the corner joints. She said, "We can afford it." May said, "How?" Lottie said, "The ridge." May looked at her mother for a moment. Then she said, "I know." She had known since the day they planted the first plugs. She had simply not said so out loud. The years between 1989 and 1993 were the years of expansion and mistake and adjustment. The way every working farm has a period of expansion and mistake and adjustment that nobody outside the farm sees. In 1990, Lottie lost approximately a third of her newest planting to a late frost in May that dropped to 24 degrees, after the plants had already broken dormancy. She had not covered them. She had read that mature English lavender was cold-hardy to zone 5 and had assumed the May planting was safe. She lost 600 plants. She spent 3 weeks replanting from divisions. She wrote in the notebook, "May frost. Lost east slope of expansion 3. My fault. Check historical frost data before assuming late planting is safe. Granger County last frost date is May 10 on average. This year, May 17. Will not assume again." She did not assume again. She began tracking the 15-year historical frost data for Granger County, which she pulled from the National Weather Service records at the Rutledge Library. She started covering her early break plants with agricultural fleece every year after March 15, regardless of the forecast. She never lost a planting to frost again. In 1991, she hired her first help, a 22-year-old woman named Gail, the daughter of a neighbor family, who had been working part-time at the feed store in Bean Station and who asked Lottie in May if she could work the summer harvest. Lottie hired her at $5.50 an hour. By the end of July, Gail was managing the harvest cutting schedule herself, while Lottie ran the still. By September, Lottie had offered her part-time year-round at $6.25 an hour. Gail accepted. She was still working on the farm 3 years later. In 1992, May came back from Knoxville for the summer and did not leave. She had finished her degree in December of 1992. She had been offered a position with an agricultural consulting firm in Nashville. She had driven home in January, ostensibly to stay for the month, while she considered the offer. By March, she was running the oil distillation operation and had told the Nashville firm she was not coming. Lottie had not asked her to stay. She had not said anything about the Nashville offer one way or the other. May had watched her mother on a January morning walk, the ridge at 6:30 in the winter cold, with a flashlight checking the base of the plants for frost heave, and she had known before she got back in her car that she was not going to Nashville. She called the firm from the kitchen phone that afternoon. She said she appreciated the offer. She said she had decided to stay in Granger County. She hung up the phone. She sat down at the kitchen table. Lottie was at the stove making coffee. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then May said, "I think we should look at the ridge expansion on the north section." Lottie set 2 cups on the table. She sat down. She opened the notebook. They worked until midnight. The call that changed the scale of the operation came in November of 1993. Phil Garner, the sourcing manager for a regional grocery chain called Cumberland Foods that ran 43 stores across eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia, had been fielding requests from his store managers for locally sourced specialty herbs and dried botanicals since 1991. The chain had watched the specialty food movement growing in its markets and had been slow to respond. By 1993, Garner was actively looking for regional suppliers who could provide consistent volume and consistent quality. He had gotten Lottie's name from the Asheville craft wholesaler she had been selling to for 4 years. The wholesaler had told him, "There is a woman in Granger County, Tennessee, named Lottie Fenn. She has been selling me dried lavender for 4 years. It is the most consistent product I receive from any supplier east of the Mississippi. Her oil yield per pound is 20% above the industry average. She is operating well below her capacity." Garner called the farm on a Thursday afternoon in November. May answered. She took down his name and his number, and she walked out to the ridge where Lottie was pulling the last of the season's fleece stakes, and she handed her mother the piece of paper. Lottie looked at it. She recognized the Cumberland Foods name. She had shopped at the Bean Station location for 11 years. She walked back to the farmhouse and called the number. Phil Garner told her what he was looking for. He needed a minimum of 200 pounds of dried lavender per month, culinary grade and floral grade, separately packed, plus 4 to 6 cases of 4-ounce lavender oil per month, delivered to his Knoxville distribution center on a monthly cycle. He was prepared to offer $16.50 per pound for the dried product and $28 per 4-ounce bottle for the oil. The numbers Lottie was hearing were almost exactly double what she had been receiving from the Asheville wholesaler. She said, "Mr. Garner, I need 4 days to look at my production numbers." He said, "Take the time you need." He gave her his direct line. He hung up. Lottie sat at the kitchen table with the notebook in front of her. May was standing in the doorway. May said, "Well?" Lottie said, "Cumberland Foods, monthly contract, $16.50 a pound for the dried." May was quiet for a moment. She did a fast calculation in her head. She said, "We can do that." Lottie said, "We can do that if I move the distillation operation into the barn and get a second still." May said, "I'll find the still." She walked to the phone. Lottie opened the notebook and started working through the production numbers by section and yield estimate and harvest window. She worked through dinner. She worked until 10 o'clock. At 10, she closed the notebook. She called Phil Garner the following Monday morning and said she would accept the contract. The first delivery was scheduled for February 1994. Lottie and May spent the winter of 1993-94 converting the equipment barn into a distillation and packing facility. May found a second copper still from a supplier in western North Carolina and brought it home on a rented trailer in December. They installed the still themselves over 2 weekends with Gale codes, with Gale helping, and a retired plumber named Aubrey Marsh from Bean Station who owed May a favor from a fence project the previous summer. Aubrey charged them nothing. He said the work was interesting. He had never seen a lavender still before. They sealed and insulated the barn through January. They ordered food-grade amber glass bottles in bulk from a supplier in Ohio. They designed their own label. Clean black text on cream paper, the words Fenn Ridge Botanicals in plain block letters, the county and the state below. May drew it. Lottie approved it without changing anything. The first labeled bottles went into the first Cumberland delivery in February 1994. Phil Garner called 2 days after the delivery arrived. He said the oil had tested at 19% above the grade standard. He said the dried product was the most uniformly cut and packed he had received from any botanical supplier. He extended the contract immediately for an additional 6 months. He told Lottie he intended to feature Fenn Ridge Botanicals in the chain's specialty food promotion in March. She thanked him and hung up. She walked out to the ridge and stood there for a while in the February, cold, looking at the rows of plants in their winter dormancy, the gray-silver foliage visible above the fleece covering at the base of each row, and she felt something she did not have a name for exactly. Not pride, closer to recognition. The thing she had reasoned out 7 years ago at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning was the thing that was happening now. She had known it was going to happen. She had simply needed to do the work between the knowing and the happening. The community in Granger County began to take notice in the spring of 1994. The first sign was a conversation at Del Phipps's hardware store in April, when a younger farmer named Carter Bledsoe came in to buy fence staples and mentioned to Del that he had seen the Fenn Ridge Botanicals label in the Cumberland food store in Bean Station and had recognized the name. Del said he had seen it too. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I told her in 1987 that lavender was a French thing." He said it without meanness. He said it the way a man says the thing he got wrong when he has had 7 years to get comfortable with having gotten it wrong. Carter said, "Well." Del said, "Well." They stood at the counter and said nothing else about it. But Del stopped telling the story about the widow and the lavender after that. He simply stopped. Hugh Casper, the retired corn farmer who had said at the Ruritan Club in 1987 that the pH on the ridge was all wrong for lavender, drove out to the farm on a Saturday morning in May of 1994. He was 74 years old. He arrived without calling. He sat in his truck for a few minutes at the end of the driveway before Lottie came out of the barn and saw him. He got out slowly. He was a big man who had gotten thin in the way large men get thin in their 70s. He walked toward her with his cap in his hand. He said, "Lottie, I want to apologize to you for something I said about your ground in 1987. She waited. He said, "I told Del Phipps at the Ruritan that the pH on your ridge was wrong for lavender. I had no idea what I was talking about. I said it like I knew. I didn't know." Lottie looked at him for a moment. She said, "Hugh, "You didn't have to come out here." He said, "I did." He looked past her at the ridge, which was just coming into spring growth, the plants putting up new gray-green foliage in the morning light. He said, "How many acres are you running now?" She said, 8.5, with plans for 2 more in the fall. He was quiet. He looked at the ridge for a long time. Then he said, "I've farmed this county for 40 years, and I never once looked at that slope and thought about drainage and sun angle. I only ever thought about what wouldn't grow there." He put his cap back on. He thanked her. He drove home. He told his wife about the visit that evening, and he did not exaggerate anything, and he did not minimize anything. He simply told it the way it had happened. Del Phipps never apologized in person. He intended to. He had meant to drive out to the farm the summer of 1994 and had kept finding reasons not to. He died of a stroke in November of 1995 at age 72. His daughter, going through his desk the week after the funeral, found a notepad page with Lottie Fenn's phone number written on it and the words, "Call about the Lavender." "Owe her something," in Del's handwriting. The ink slightly faded. The way ink fades when a note has been written and left and looked at many times without being acted on. His daughter did not know what it meant. She did not call Lottie. But Lottie heard about the notepad from someone who had heard it from the daughter. She heard about it on a Monday in December of 1995, while standing in the Cumberland Foods in Bean Station, buying coffee. She stood in the aisle for a moment after hearing it. She thought about Del's face at the hardware store counter in 1987. The way he had said, "Lavender is a French thing, not unkind, simply limited." She thought without bitterness that the limitation had always been the problem and never the malice. Most of the people who had laughed or doubted or looked past the ridge had not done it from cruelty. They had done it from the habit of seeing only what they had been taught to see. She had been taught the same things. The difference was that she had needed to see something else, and so she had looked until she found it. She bought her coffee and drove home. By 1998, Fenn Ridge Botanicals was supplying Cumberland Foods and 2 additional regional buyers across 4 states, operating on 11 acres of ridge production with a full-time staff of 4, including May, who was by then managing the entire commercial operation. The farm had paid off the original equipment loan in 1993. Lottie had purchased an adjacent 7 acres of ridgeland from an estate sale in 1995 and had begun planting it in 1996. The annual gross revenue from the operation in 1998 was approximately $190,000. May had married in 1997. Her husband was a man named Tom, an extension agent from neighboring Hawkins County who had heard about Fenn Ridge from Terry Albright. The same young agent who had found Lottie that first publication in 1987 and who had driven over to the farm on a professional visit in 1995 and had never quite stopped coming back. Tom managed his extension work and helped on the farm on weekends and had, by 1998, begun developing a written guide to lavender cultivation on alkaline ridge soils in East Tennessee that he intended to publish through the UT extension system. He dedicated it, when it was published in 2001, to Hazel Fenn. He had meant to write Lottie Fenn. He told May when he showed her the proofs. May showed her mother. Lottie looked at the dedication. She said, "It's fine." She meant it. It was fine. The name on the dedication was close enough to true. Lottie Fenn walked the ridge on Granger County every morning until 2019, when she was 69 and her knees had decided they were finished with the slope. She walked it in every season, in February frost and July heat and the particular October mornings in East Tennessee when the air smells of wood smoke and damp stone, and the lavender has gone to seed, and the rose looks silver and exhausted and completed. She walked it sometimes with May, sometimes with May's 2 daughters, who had been helping on the farm since they were old enough to carry a harvest basket. She walked it mostly alone, with a cup of black coffee that she carried in the same chipped enamel mug she had been using since 1986, the year before the planting began. She gave one interview. The University of Tennessee College of Agriculture asked her in 2003 to speak at a conference on alternative crops for Minardland. She agreed to speak for 20 minutes. She spoke for 18. She did not talk about the community's skepticism. She did not talk about Del Phipps's hardware counter, or Hugh Casper's pH comment, or the Ruritan Club, or the tone that Granger County had used when it talked about the widow and her ridge. She talked about the soil test and what the numbers told her. She talked about the spacing decision and why she had chosen 30 inches over the standard 24. She talked about morning oil concentration and why harvest timing before 8 a.m. had increased her yield by 14%. She talked about what she had gotten wrong and when she had figured out she had gotten it wrong and what she had changed. She spoke for 18 minutes and then she stopped and sat down and answered 4 questions from the audience and drove home. May asked her that evening how it had gone. Lottie said it went fine. May said, "Did you talk about the beginning? About how it started?" Lottie said, "I talked about the soil test." May said, "That is the beginning." Lottie thought about that. She said, "I suppose it is." The lesson she passed to May, and that May has been working out how to pass to her own daughters, has not been about lavender. It has not been about the ridge. It has not been about the oil yield, or the distillation curve, or the harvest timing, or the Cumberland Foods contract, or any of the particular facts of the particular operation. It has been about what happens when you are standing in a hardware store in 1987. And a man you have known your whole life tells you that the thing you have calculated and tested and stayed up until 2 in the morning running numbers on is a French thing, and this is Granger County. What you do in that moment determines everything that comes after. Lottie had thanked Del Phipps and driven home and ordered the seed stock. That was the decision, not the planting, not the harvest, not the contract, the drive home after Del said what Del said, and the ordering of the seed stock anyway. Everything else was just work, and the work done day after day in the alkaline soil of a ridge that every reasonable man in the county had written off, had produced the only answer that had ever needed to be given, which was not a speech, and not a vindication, and not a moment at a distribution dock with a check for $11,000, though that moment had been real, and Lottie had stood there and felt the weight of it, and then put the check in her coat pocket and driven home through the November morning to walk the ridge before the light failed, the way she had been doing for 7 years, the way she would go on doing for 25 more.